I have flown in. Hand over to you, Peter.
Yeah, just a bit, but so I can still read. I can't.
You said what you want. All right, a bit more.
Touch more. That'll do it. Yep. Yep. Everybody happy with that? Everybody can see it?
Yep.
Right, for those that don't know me, Peter Martin, and I completed a career in the Royal Air Force, 35 years. Suddenly realised that I'd flown in quite a few different machines. The talk started when the Vintage Machinery Club were getting short of speakers and they were charging something to arrive, and I said, well, I can put a thing together. Aircraft What I've flown in, that is a dedication to Morecambe and Wise, plays what he wrote. The first time I ever put it up, as soon as I put that up, a woman said, that grammar is awful. I said, well, I'm an awful person. But at least she was watching the screen.
You should have put Aircraft What I have flown in.
First ever aircraft I did fly in was before I joined the Air Force. I was in the Air Training Corps and was at the time, in the 50s, was the RAF #1 trainer. Took over from the Tigermoth. And from what I can remember, I learned absolutely nothing. The pilots, a lot of them were just eking out their time till they left to get their pension, and they got a space cadet in the back they weren't really interested in, so I didn't get a lot out of it. However, later on, when I got a job with the Combined Cadet Forces, and we used to take cadets down to the air experience flights, Filton, places like that, we had some really good pilots there, and I used to do the ops, and then they used to give me the last flight of the day. And I used to get a free flying lesson out of it. Also, some of the pilots were quite interesting to fly with. And one of the guys came out with, he said, Peter, he said, I realised when I was getting old, he said, I'd look at a young lady and think, wonder what her mum's like. But as he said to me, he said, it's an easy aircraft to fly, but a difficult aircraft to fly really well, but very, very enjoyable. That's the cockpit, very basic, and that compass there was put in loads and loads of aircraft, and I'm the proud possessor of one of those in its original transportation box, which, believe it or not, at an RAF station, I was walking past Supply Squadron, I saw this nice box. I said, where's that going? He said, in the skip. I said, no, it's not. And in there is one which is practically brand new. So I'm very pleased with that. But as I say, nice little aeroplane to fly. When I joined the Air Force, started my apprenticeship at RAF Halton, and just about every station in the Air Force then had an Avro Anson. Designed by Roy Chadwick, which incidentally was the same guy that designed the Lancaster. They built in total 11,000 of them, but there's only one left flying. And anybody that wanted to go flying could do. Well, very early on I realised that I couldn't fly because I've always been short-sighted, but I thought at least I can fix them. So that's why I joined the Air Force. And we took off from Halton, and we flew over what was then completed a section of the M1, 1959. That was quite interesting. And a funny story coming out of that, which didn't involve me, was I met up with a pilot a few years later who flew those, and it was set up as a cockpit classroom for training navigators. And he said, I never ever crossed the same bit of coast in the same place in about 2.5 years. He said, but one of the most interesting things that happened to him, he qualified, and most of the pilots then were sergeants. He said, and I was sent to a unit, a holding unit, and they said one day, right, get some hours under your belt. He said, we'll crew you up with the Anson pilot, who was a master pilot. And he said, we've got a job to do today. He said a chap that had been in the Air Force all his life, had no relations or anything. His wish was to have his ashes scattered from an aeroplane. He said, so I got in with this master pilot. He said, and we took off. He said, then I made a mistake. All aircraft have got what they call a DV window, which is normally about their direct vision. And it's optically true, and it normally opens. He said, I made the error, he said, of taking the lid off the casket before I poked it out the window. So all the ashes went all over him. So this master pilot turned around to him and said, don't mess about with it now. He said, let's go back on the ground, clear it all up, and we'll have another go tomorrow. So there's this young sergeant pilot on his hands and knees, sweeping all this lot back up again. And suddenly this master pilot started laughing. And he said to him, what's that? He said, I'm thinking about it. He said, he's looking down on me and thinking, typical Air Force, buggered about till the last. Next aircraft I flew in, I finished all my training and was posted originally to Javelins and then to a Lightning Squadron. And at the time we didn't have any Lightnings based in Cyprus. And the old Turks were having a bit of a go. So I was on Treble 1 Squadron at Watersham, and we got detached out to Cyprus to fend off the old thing. And the nice thing about this picture, and I've chosen it, is because it has got Royal Air Force Transport Command on it. Because years later, when they tried to save some money, and they combined a lot of the, it got Air Support Command, and it didn't seem the same. Flew a lot on these, and one thing you could do when I was based at Lynham on these, that you could go as what they call servicing crew. If it was doing a long trip, and you could put your name down, and you could go on the flight with another guy, and you would do the refueling, turn round, check everything. One day, the other guy went sick, so I was by myself. And it was to go out to Nairobi and pick up some army troops. We flew out there, had a night stop. The next morning, the captain said, we're right on the limit of the temperature. Nairobi is two things that jet engines hate. It's high and it's hot, very thin air. And it really knocks the power down. But what we could do, we could put water injection on the engines. And behind the back of each nacelle, about there, was a 12-gallon tank. So they gave you a 45-gallon drum. Of course, it didn't quite fill all the tanks. So what you did, you filled the outers first. It was a one-shot thing, so when the water did finally run out, the aircraft didn't swing violently, and divided it between the inboard engines. I'll now go on to the flight deck. When I first started flying on them, you had the pilot there, co-pilot, engineer, and in the 60s, we had air signallers, SIGGIs. When I went back onto them on the 70s, the SIGGIs, because they'd had decent radios fitted, were redundant. So when I used to go as servicing crew, that used to be my seat there. Anyway, filled up the tanks, we taxied out, and off we went. Engineer switched in the water injection. 4 green lights on the panel when water was flowing, and off we went. V1 decision speed came up quite quickly, but then the aircraft would not accelerate. And we had to persevere. We'd gone literally beyond point of no return. And at the end of the runway was a huge fence, and then the game park. Anyway, we did clear the fence at the end of the runway and made it in, praying the water wouldn't run out. And we finally got a bit of altitude, and the captain says, "Hey Peter," he says, "go and have a look at the passengers, see they're all right." We were carrying a load of army guys. Went down the back and I came back, I said, "They're over the moon." They thought the trip through the game park was so they could take photographs. And this bloke says, "Here, this was great, see them giraffes run?" I thought, yeah, we were trying to bloody avoid them. Anyway, they radioed back and they gave us the wrong temperature. It was actually 2 degrees C higher, and we were outside limits. But the two pilots, they were both flight lieutenants, but they were ex-master pilots, very, very experienced. And all the flying that I did in those, I think that was the only close thing we made, making a hole in the ground. But that was quite something. But very nice, nice to work on. Very electric aeroplane, because a lot of the systems have been developed for the Bristol Brabazon, and because it's so big, and you didn't want huge control runs on it. Even the engines in those days, and it was a 50s design, came into service with the Air Force in 1959. And as I say, the engines were electrically controlled, not electronic, and not a computer in sight. And it was an ultra throttle system, and it had magnetic amplifiers that went in and out of saturation. A bit of a devil. The only right thing was it was a devil to refuel.
Let's ask you a question. They did call it a car the Silent Giant, didn't they?
Whispering Giant, it was called.
Giant.
Yeah.
What were they like inside?
It wasn't the quietest of aeroplanes, but it wasn't as noisy as a Herc.
It's quite elegant, isn't it?
Oh, beautiful. Yeah.
You know, when it flew, it wasn't.
It was. It was a very, they used to call it Queen of the Skies.
Really?
Yep. No. It was.
Quite an elegant aeroplane.
Yeah. 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 Not many airlines had them, but those that did were very, very pleased with them. But it does say it was a nice aeroplane. Hawker Siddeley 748 called an Andover, and I flew in that one. It's posted to Malaya. First of all, I'll apologise if I spit a bit. I'm sorry. I had some dental work done, and my face this side is a little bit numb, so bear with me. And flew out to Changi in a Britannia, and then we're flown up to RAAF Butterworth in an Andover. Again, quite a nice aeroplane flying. Did actually work on them for a little while down at Thorney Island, and went up on air test a couple of times with them. And that was the flight deck for the Andover. What you can't see is there was another seat there, so you could sit between the two pilots when you went up on flight test. The first time I went up on flight test, the guy said, "Go and get your parachute." I thought he was joking, being used to 4-engine transport aircraft. No, he didn't carry parachutes. When I got out there, he said, "You haven't got your parachute." So he said, "We've only got 2 engines." I said, "All right then. But you put your harness on." It was one that you left by the door, and you clipped it on if you needed it, so you didn't have the bulk of it walking around all the time. Bristol Freighter. And I actually flew in one of those. I'm pleased I got that picture because it was operated by the Royal New Zealand Air Force. When my job was coming to an end in Malaya, I was offered a job in Singapore, which I wasn't going to refuse because I was enjoying myself in the Far East. So I flew down to Changi in a Andover, but there wasn't one going back. And they said, "Oh, we're doing a training flight. Would you like to come with us?" So I got a flight in a Bristol Freighter, and that was quite something. But that was quite a popular aeroplane. Very, very popular over here. They used to run it backwards and forwards to Channel Islands, called British Air Ferries, I think it was. And yeah, they earned quite a lot of money for the company. They were quite good. was out in Bahrain on Canberras, and unfortunately got smacked off my motorbike by a guy in a Land Rover. Broke my right leg quite badly, and they shipped me down to Aden Steamer Point Hospital in a stretcher in one of those. And the crew insisted, because I'd never seen the flight deck. It was quite a way up, as you can see. And I was down in the freight bay. They lifted me up in the stretcher so I could see around the flight deck. They were very, very obliging. Again, it was a popular aircraft as far as the Air Force was concerned. Rolls-Royce Dart engines. Then I got to what I consider was one of the most enjoyable bits I spent in the RAF, and that is the short Belfast. Very large aircraft, 4-time turboprops, and everybody that decried it had never flown on it. It was a gentlemanly way of flying because it was slow. Crew duty day was 14 hours. Also, once you'd reached a certain rank, you could apply for crew chief, which I did. And so I went on courses and I got taught all trades to work on those. So where that went in the world, I flew with it. So it was a good job. And I was very, very lucky because when they trained up a new crew, they used to put a global trainer on. The Belfast used to fly all the way around the world, training 2 new crews. And we toddled across. We got to Hong Kong, and they said, we want you to take 2 Wessex helicopters. It was big enough to take those. And we said, oh, that's all right. Then they said, no, it isn't. You haven't got the pallets to put them on. So we had 2 days in Hong Kong while a Herc flew the pallets up for us to fly the Wessex down to Singapore. So that was quite good. Then we considered, we proceeded across Australia, across Pacific to Hawaii. We got to Hawaii, minimum of 14 hours on the ground. So we thought, oh, that's a bit disappointing. Took off from there, and about 15 minutes out, the engineer said, can you come up on the flight deck? We've got a problem. So we looked at the instruments, and I said, I said, we've got some damage to the low pressure compressor, twin spool engine. So we went back, looked inside it with an intrascope, and there were some blades damaged. So it was an engine change. So we then had to wait for Britannia to fly us out a spare engine. Well, the Britannia went US before it got to us. So we ended up by spending 10 days in Hawaii. It was hell. But the nice thing about that is the American Air Force base is called Hickam. And the nice thing about American Air Force bases is you've got all the equipment there. And they're most helpful people in the world. Anything you wanted, you got. So we had the proper stands, cranes and everything. So it was good. I thoroughly enjoyed my time on those. Now to one of Ed's favourite aeroplanes. Quite happily, crew chiefing on Belfast. Middle of the 70s. And they came up with some defence cuts. And originally, they were going to halve the Herc fleet, halve the Britannia fleet, keep all 10 Belfasts, run the VC-10s down to 6 and use it purely as a VIP flight. And the Army stepped in and said, oi, if you do that, we've got no rapid troop deployment. So they had a rethink, kept all the Hercs, the whole Britannia fleet went. Unfortunately, so did the Belfast fleet. So overnight, I was virtually out of a job. However, because they were going to originally run down to 610, they'd also run the crew chiefs down. And they were short. And I'd worked on VC-10s on my own trade before I'd gone crew chief on the Belfast. So they said, well, would you like to transfer across to the VC-10? Yes, please, because I started my 5-year tour all over again.
Did they seriously say, would you like?
Yep. Beautiful aeroplane to fly in, beautiful aeroplane to work on, and a very, very safe aeroplane.
Stunning plane to fly too.
Yeah. Most memorable trips on those was we're doing a troop run down to Belize, and took off from Belize, hadn't got to about 1,500 feet, and there was a huge bang from the back end. And at first we thought, because we'd had a little crop spraying aircraft, we'd let take off first. And Don will say about this, the reason you do that is you get a thing, if you have a big aircraft, called wake turbulence. And if you try and follow a big aeroplane, it can flip a little aeroplane straight over. So they said, right, watch him clear the circuit. And we thought, oh, he's come up underneath us. And then it went bang for the second time and the whole aircraft shook, and I thought, nope, that's an engine. Because we were carrying a brigadier, he'd taken my seat on the flight deck by invitation of the captain. So got out my seat, walked and stood behind the engineer, and didn't say anything, don't want to interrupt them while they're working. He saw me behind there, and I just said to him, what was the EGT? And I think max EGT on those was 495, exhaust gas temperature, sorry. And he said it was climbing up towards 700 when I pulled it back. So I just went to him. And we then discussed what our options were after they shut the engine down. And one thing happened which I could not believe. The captain then quite rightly said, I'm not willing to start out over the water with full load of passengers. And I said, well, we've got problems on the ground there for parking, and there was no equipment. And he turned around this brigadier and said, what's convenient to you, sir? He'd actually asked a passenger, at which point I had a sense of human failure and walked off the flight deck. Anyway, we turned back, landed, and they said, what are the options? And I said, well, I know what the best option is. I said, you send a replacement aircraft out to take the passengers, and we will 3-engine ferry that aircraft back. I went, what? I said, yep, the aircraft's designed to do it. There's plenty of power there. Our lords and masters were at Uphaven. And after I gave all the reasons with limited parking space, no equipment, and things like that, they agreed. So they sent a replacement aircraft out. And as I say, the parking was so tight that said to them, right, what we'll have to do is once the aircraft coming in has taxied past the dispersal, we started up a couple of engines, followed him round, so he got in front of us, then loaded up the passengers, and this brigadier was nowhere to be seen. And the captain said, I said, nothing to do with me, sir. Engineer, don't have anything to do with passengers. Anyway, he never turned up. And the captain says, I'm not waiting any longer. He said, unplug, come forward and give us a wave, did all the good things, and waved him off. The next thing you have to do is to stop the engine windmilling in flight with the airflow. You gag it. Quite easy to do on those. There's a twin spool compressor again. What you did, took the starter motor off, and bolted a plate on which had the starter drive welded to it, and that locked the HP compressor. And on the nose of the engine, it had a set of oil pumps that lubricated the front bearing on the Conway engine. You took that off and locked those up. Well, halfway through me fitting this gagging kit, Army car arrived. And out steps this brigadier who starts looking around at the skies. Hey, you. So I thought, just carry on working. You in the green suit. Carry on working. Then I'm up this rickety old ladder. He's shaking the ladder. So I said, how can I help you, sir? He said, where's my aeroplane? You know, 3-ton truck is his beck and call, the brigadier. So I said, it's gone. When will it be back? So I said, well, we don't always send the same aircraft back. You stupid man. And I thought, I'm winning here. Because I was taught by a very wise old warrant officer. And he said, when you're talking to senior officers, he said, there are 3 main rules. Always be polite. Always finish the sentence with sir, and make sure you're bloody right. So he said, oh. He says, it's gone then. I said, yes. He said, where's my baggage? I said, that's on it. Poor old driver, he was trying very hard not to laugh because Army Scotty had been in trouble. Anyway, the captain that had brought the other one out was one of our exchange captains we had. He was Canadian. Super guy he was. He really was. And he said, right. He said, yep, they've cleared us for the 3-engine ferry. He said, but we're not allowed to carry passengers. And this brigadier signalled back and got himself authorised to fly on it, which the captain wasn't very happy about because it was his fault he missed the aircraft in the first place. So did all the good bits. We're going one leg to Nassau, refuel, the next day doing the leg across the Atlantic on the 3 engines. Walked up the steps and the brigadier goes to walk on the flight deck. And the captain says to him, where are you going? He said, no, you're not. He said, I want my crew chief there. He said, I've only got 3 engines. He said, we have a further problem. I want him where I can get his advice. So, and he turned around to me, he said, you sit in your seat, he said, and you stay there. And they sat him down the back, and they bloody froze him all the way back. And he came up, he said, can't you eat? And the captain said with a straight face, he said, that's why we're not allowed to carry passengers. He said, we're down to 3 compressors. Of course, we could have kept the cabin warm. He said, but, he said, it's difficult with the pressurisation and warming it up. And he was sat there with all the blankets around him. Anyway, we did the quick leg up to Nassau. I refueled it. And the other thing, because it was designed to do 3-engine ferry, was all the hydraulics were behind the rear toilets, behind there. And you had a ferry link, but you took a pipe off, connected it up to another thing, and there was an actuator. You left the 2 hydraulic systems completely independent while you were taxiing out. And then for takeoff and landing, the engineer had a switch on his panel, switched it so it common the hydraulic systems up for takeoff and landing. So I say the aircraft designed to do that. Very, very nice aeroplane. And we did the leg across the Atlantic. The old nav was given a check every quarter of an hour, saying if we lose an engine, we can make so-and-so. If we lose it, we can make so-and-so. And then he said, Shannon, here we come. Now we can make Prestwick. And then Bryce Norton, here we come. And it took us an hour longer on 3 engines, and we used exactly the same amount of fuel. And when they people, British Airways Engine Overhaul Limited down at Treforest, which is just outside Cardiff, when they stripped the engine, all the last stage of the HP compressor all curled forward. We'd had a massive surge. And I said, no, I wasn't going to run the engine. I said that you went on the aircraft when it went bang. And they reckon if we had have run it, got anywhere near max, you get what they call an uncontained failure, where the blades start coming through the casing. And the danger on the VC-10 is you can see how close the engines are together. It could take the next one out to it. The good thing was, it was a number 2 engine that went there. We still had the 2 outboards, so we still had the thrust reversers. So it was quite an interesting exercise. There's the flight deck. You can't quite see, but there is another seat there. That used to be my seat. So it was good because I could see everything that was going on and could talk to both the navigator there and the engineer there. Ed said he was a little bit disturbed because the engineer had the throttles, the power levers. And he said he would much prefer to have had control of those himself. But as I say, nice aeroplane to work on, and certainly a nice aeroplane to fly on. And I think in my 5 years, I clocked up nearly 3,000 flying hours. So,
Just a question.
yep, they're interconnected. Yeah, if I'll go back one, right? You've got the throttles there,
Right.
okay, and there is a set just over his shoulder there on the engineer's position. The only thing he couldn't do was on the 2 outer ones there and there, you've got the thrust reversers. So you needed to lift those up and pull them over backwards to get reverse thrust on 1 and 4.
They have total control of the 2 at the front, have total control on takeoff.
No, what happened was he used to ask for full power and the engineer used to give him full power from the engineer's position.
Ooh.
And he would control the power throughout the flight. And as they were coming into land, he was asked for various percentages, because it's percentage power on the engines. And then you go idle, and then the co-pilot would put his hands over the top, and then as soon as it touched down, the captain would say full reverse, and they'd also pull the spoilers out.
And that must have been pretty weird, wasn't it, if you were flying something like that?
Well, they seem to operate quite well like that. Yeah. We had an occasion. One of the most interesting runs we used to do was to take the Gurkhas that were retiring up to Kathmandu and bring the raw recruits back up to Hong Kong. And the approach into Hong Kong, this is the old airport, Kai Tak, was quite hairy to say the least. They improved it a bit and only did one approach, and that was on a Belfast, on what they call the old Charlie Charlie approach, where you came in at right angles to the runway till you saw the checkerboard which mounted on, then you started to turn. And you didn't see the runway you were going to land on until you started to roll out the turn.
Is it true there's a statement, bumping ship to Hong Kong?
Yeah. As well as you were coming over all the blocks of flats. Yeah, it was quite an interesting approach there. And quite often we have a very experienced engineer and a co-pilot that was whinging, and he used to say to him, "You shut up, or I'll give you the power you ask for, not the power you require." We were coming in one day and we got a bit slow, and the co-pilot went, AT, and the captain went, 90, and actually banged his own throttle forward. I finished my time on BC-10, and I say it was a 5-year tour you could do as a crew chief. And I thought, well, that's me finished. And I was going to leave the RF. And then for the last 18 months of my service, I was on instructor duties. And right out of the blue, flight commander came in classroom one day and said, sorry to interrupt, can I talk to you outside? I thought, oh, no, can't remember. He said, congratulations. He said, if you accept it, you've been promoted. I thought, oh. He said, it's up to Valley on Hawks. Bit of a difference. However, I can assure you, Dom, for fun flying, they are magic. And the reason I got to fly, the first thing that happened was, first thing in the morning, they used to send an aircraft off called the weather ship. While all the students were getting their briefing, the weather ship used to go off and assess the area, if the visibility was okay in the low flying area, and things like that. So I thought, might have a go in one of these. So I put my name down for the weather ship and sat in the back seat. And as you can see, the back seat is quite high up. In actual fact, the visibility out there is absolutely phenomenal. Normally that's where the instructor would sit and the students in the front. But as I say, the visibility out that back seat is absolutely phenomenal. Because it was a training aircraft, any airframe job you did on it had to have an air test before you could let a student. And I was in servicing control, looking after all the servicing, everything. The first desk job, funnily enough, I'd had in the Air Force. And the unit test pilot used to come up on a daily basis and say, have you got anything for us? But it had to have 2 pilots in it, or 2 people in it, because they wanted it operated from the back seat as well as the front, make sure everything worked. And he couldn't get another pilot. And I said to him jokingly, I said, I'll come with you, Andy. And I had a very, very autocratic wing commander. And he said, you can't. So I said, why is that, sir? He said, because you haven't done the pressure chamber at North Luffenham. Well, as a crew chief, I had to go through all that training, and I still got my medical ticket. Now, when I only came home once a fortnight from there, because that was 200 and odd miles cross country each way, back to Swindon, and took it back, and I said, what you're saying, sir, is the only thing that's stopping me? He said, yes. I went, there we go. And he went, oh my God. So I got to fly in the back seat on air tests. And the first time I flew in it on the weather ship, you think being a small aircraft compared with a big aircraft, you get thrown around a bit. No, dead smooth, very, very good. That was the cockpit on the Hawk. As I say, very, very nice aircraft to fly. In fact, it was too good to fly. And they had a problem because they used to give the guys their wings after they finished the Hawk fast jet course. And then they get posted onto a Phantom operational conversion unit. Couldn't handle it. And we ended up quite a few of them. They'd done the fast jet course, and we ended up as co-pilots on Hercs and VC-10s because they just couldn't handle another fast jet.
Any particular reason that they couldn't handle it?
Well, apparently the Phantom was a bit of a beast to fly, from what I can gather. Yeah, that was the throttle there and built-in high-pressure cock. So when you push it forward, obviously you got full power. When you came back, you got so far, and once you taxied in, you then push it over and back. Another interesting trip I had on those, we had an ex-Red Arrows pilot, and he was posted back to Central Flying School, which was based at Valley, to train the instructors. A chap called Byron Walters, bit of a maverick. And the Red Arrows then was still at Kemble, and he lived at, just up the road, get it in a minute, summer for Keens. And we got chatting one day and he said, I'm taking a hawk down to Kemble for the weekend. Do you want a lift? Well, it used to take me 5.5 hours on a good day to drive down from Valley all through the mountains and everything. 3/4 of an hour in a Herc. So it was no contest. So I said, yes, please. And then one day he said, hey, he said, we've got a little job. He said, they're opening Henry Moore Gallery in Leeds. He said, and we're going to do a fly past. He said, then we'll disappear off down to Kemble. You interested? Yes, please. So we flew up to Church Fenton first because they were going to put 12 jet Provosts in formation in the front and a Diamond 4 of Hawks at the back. So we strapped in and off we went. Well, the chap in charge of our formation was a Navy Lieutenant Commander. And all the time we were formating up, he knew Byron was ex-Red Arrows, and he was saying, tighten up number 3, and he was riding him a bit. Anyway, we timed it round, got him, and he said, look sharp, he said, there are some reporters on one of the roofs watching. Oh, Byron says, I'll give them something to report. Anyway, we did the fly past, and he said, permission to break formation. And as usual, on my command. Anyway, 1 minute, I'm looking up the jet pipe of 12 jet Provosts, and the next minute we're upside down and I'm looking at chimney pots. However, it backfired because we then, laughing to ourselves, came back low level down to Kemble, parked up for the weekend, and the reason we went down to Kemble, he had to do a low level Navex on the Monday morning as part of his training. And I had to do, there was a problem with the Ador engine, which I had to do an inspection on before we came back. So did the inspection, strapped in and off we went, and did this low level Navex through the Welsh mountains, 420 knots, 7 miles a minute at 250 feet. Absolutely brilliant. We landed quite happy to be met by this furious naval guy. He said, what do you think you were playing at? He said, what happened? He said, well, he said, one of the reporters dialed 999, said, I've just seen a hawk fall out the sky, we think it's crashed. So Byron was in a bit of trouble. But as I say, but the funny thing was, I never ever felt unsafe with him. I say all the time we used to fly lower level, but I thoroughly enjoyed my time on the Hawks. Then came back onto Hercs. This isn't one of ours, this is an American Marine one. And the reason I can tell you that is because it's got the refueling pods on. However, ours were equipped with exactly the same countermeasure, missile countermeasure. And Ray Evans, VHE, who a lot of you know, was our unit test pilot at Lynham, and he did some of the trials firing those. Again, nice aeroplane to work on, flew a lot on them. That was the flight deck. That was a view out the back when these do low level. Very, very noisy though. And this was the only way to travel. You slung a cargo net in the middle, stuck your sleeping bag in there and crawled into that. But as I say, did a lot of flying in those, enjoyable flying. Best time really was when I did my tour down the Falklands. I was down there with the Hercules tankers. And again, we could fly as much low level as we liked. And didn't upset anybody. And one day, one of the captains came in and he said, we haven't got a problem. They've got a problem down at South Georgia. The army guys down there have lost their fresh water pump. It would take the ship some time to steam down there to give them a new one. We couldn't open the freight bay like you can see it on there. Let me go back one. Because there was a ton of hose drum unit refueling equipment on there and the ramp was permanently locked. But the side doors, which are just about there and there, we could open. He said, do you think that we could drop the pump out the side door into Grytviken Harbour? So I said, I don't see why not. He said, okay. And he said, we'll go tomorrow morning. And he said, but I want you to come with me. He said, because if we do have to divert somewhere, he said, I want to be able to help you to handle the servicing to get the aircraft back. I said, okay then. Went in the next morning and he said, weather's not good. He said, snowstorms down at South Georgia. He said, but they are desperate, obviously, fresh water. So he said, we're going to go down there and give it a try. I said, okay, we went down there and it was bad. And he said, I'm going to do a dummy run first. He said, you see what it's like when you open the door. And the door came inwards and then you slid it up into the ceiling at the back. So it's on my headset, opened the door, all the snow. Anyway, he kept it steady, then he put the power on and they climbed out because Grytviken Harbour is surrounded by mountains. So he said, that wasn't too bad. He said, we'll do for a proper run then. So I said, okay then. So we've got flotation gear on the pump, positioned it in the doorway, and above the door, I don't know if you can see it on this one, you've got your jump lights, which are red and green light. He said, we'll do it on the lights. I said, yep, fine. So the red light comes on and you get ready. So open the door, got the pump in the thing, and looked up, green light, whoosh, out it went, no trouble at all. As soon said, load gone, and he climbed out. Well, down the back, we used to carry extra dinghies, quite tall ones, in case something, especially the helicopters we had down at the Falklands, went in the sea, and we could drop them another dinghy. As he was climbing out, we hit a bit of a bump, and I was thrown against these dinghies, and it winded me. And I was all right, but I couldn't speak, and the load master was going, you're right, you're right. So I went up on the flight deck. He said, come up on the flight deck, we'll have a cup of tea. And the captain turned around and he says, good job. And I looked at him, he looked dreadful. What we didn't know, he got a chest infection and he shouldn't have been flying. And I said, you look awful. He said, you all right? Because I was a little bit white as well. I said, yeah, I'm fine, I'm fine. He said, okay. He said, autopilot won't work. I said, all right then. Well, all the avionic gear was underneath the flight deck. You had to take a little ladder out, crawl out underneath. I tried reseating all that, no good. So they're going to have to fly. It's about 700 nautical miles from South Georgia back to Falkland Islands. Going to fly it back manually. And he said, I really could do with a bit of a kit. So he said, I'll tell you what, he said, you can have my seat. So I sat in the captain's seat and the co-pilot said, here you are, he said, I'll give you a flying lesson. The nice thing about that, there's no one else around, you're miles away from base. And the other thing, that while I was working on the Hercs, to renew my ground running licence, I had to go in the sim every 6 months, because you can do your fire drills in the sim if you had an engine fire, which obviously you can't do while you're running the aircraft. And quite often, we do it while we're on nights, and the sim guys used to say, do us a favour, can you fly it for us so that we can sort a few problems out? So I got quite a bit of time flying the simulator. So I settled myself in, got all nicely trimmed, and then co-pilot said, Pete, he says, I'm busting for a leak. Are you happy there? Yep. About 16,000 feet. Yep. So I'm quite happy there. And then the nav says, course change. Start from left, heading so-and-so. So I lean forward and you've got what they call a bug on your instrument. Alter the bug. I said, okay, turning left. Turned. A little bit back on the stick so the nose didn't drop. What I didn't know was I'd been set up, hadn't I? They were standing behind me. But I was concentrating so flaming hard. And the other thing about it was we were carrying an air traffic lady officer with us, and she was a bit snooty. I don't know, air traffic officers, I never got on well with them. And she'd come up on the flight deck, and she hadn't seen the captain Dougie asleep on the bunk. All she could see was his back and the fellow. And she said, oh, Dougie, she said, this is a nice, smooth flight. And I leaned around and I said, oh, thank you very much. Oh, it's you. But as I say, down there, we could do that and, you know, there were no repercussions. Yeah. Tristar, nice to fly on, never worked on them. First time I flew on one of those was they got a problem with the Herc tanker down at Ascension Island. So I flew down to Ascension Island on the Herc, 13 hours and 20 minutes. Sorted out the problem down there, and I thought, no, and I'm getting the Tristar back, 8 hours and a breakfast. So that was my time on the Tristar. That was a Tristar flight deck. That was quite nice. Dragon Rapide. One of the world's, well, one of our country's first really airliners. An aircraft built to carry passengers, paying passengers. And the reason I got a flight in those, we did an open day at Holton, and a company bought a Dragon Rapide in, and we're doing flights in them. And you had to swing the prop on those. And that was quite interesting. So I got a flight in one of those, built in about 1935, something like that.
East African was actually operated two of those, one around the Lake Victoria and one up and down the coast.
Yeah. Yeah.
They used to go into Croydon and Surrey.
Yeah. They're Gypsy Queen engines, 6-cylinder, and they were rebuilding one up at Membury. Because I saw a friend of mine in town about 10 years ago, and he said, oh, you interested in coming up? He said, I know you could work on those engines, but I just didn't have the time. And I say, it was quite pleasant.
There is actually one based at Membury still.
Is there? Oh, that must have been the one then, yeah. Cessna 172. The reason I got to fly on that was when I was travelling round, one of the guys that was with us had a PPL, and if there was one, the first trip we did was out at Gander, and we used to put in some money, and he used to give us a trip round the local area. So I got to fly in a little Cessna. Cockpit on a Cessna. Beagle Pup. The RAF had those as a trainer called a Bulldog. The reason I got a flight in one of those was I was in Hong Kong on the Gurkha trooping, and the licensed engineer for the British Airways VC-10 was a New Zealander, hell of a nice guy. And the British Airways VC-10 was taxiing out, and the flaps locked out. Because they're so big, they had a very sophisticated safety system on them. And if it looked like one of them was getting out of synchronization, it just locked the whole system out. And we devised a quick fix to those. You roared up into the forward freight bay where all the electrics were, stuck your multimeter across the summing unit, checked the voltages there on our little checklist, and it told you which synchro was broken. And we said, right, is that synchro? Have you got one? He said, yeah. So leave the passengers on. And we changed the synchro for them in 20 minutes, and they never even had to take the passengers off. So they were over the moon. And I knew he was the chief flying instructor in the Hong Kong Flying Club. And he said, what do we owe you? I said, any chance for a flight round the area? He said, well, funnily enough, he said, we've just taken delivery of a brand new Beagle Pup. We've unpacked it and built it, and it's got to be air tested. Would you like to come with us? So I got a trip round all the islands in Hong Kong. Very, very clever what they've done, and joined about 5 islands together to make a reservoir for fresh water. That was quite enjoyable. Yeah, nice little aeroplane to fly in. Aha. Evans VP2. This was a home-built aeroplane, and they did a VP1, which was a single-seater, and a VP2. When I got posted down to St Athan, my wing commander, who was a keen pilot, had a VP2, and on a Wednesday afternoon, which the RAF used to laughingly call sports afternoon, he'd come into my office and say, what are you doing this afternoon? Not a lot, sir. Good, we're going flying. So we used to fly around all the valleys in this little home-built aeroplane. The original ones were designed to have a Volkswagen engine in them. Fine for the VP1, but very underpowered for the VP2. And he actually had another engine in his VP2, but it still used to take us about a quarter of an hour to get to 1,000 feet. And very, very friendly where you sat side by side there. Yeah, but good fun. Tigermoth, the RAF's #1 trainer in the Second World War, and a lot of them in the flying clubs. And I was visiting my mate who was posted to Cranwell. And we went up to Cranwell on the Sunday afternoon to their flying club, and they had an Oster and a Tigermoth. And the Oster had a fuel leak and an oil leak. And my mate says, this bloke here can fix anything. Again, nice gypsy major, easy to work on. One that we worked on and I did on my apprenticeship. Anyway, I fixed their Oster for them. And they said, would you like a flight? I said, I'd like a flight in that. And he said, all right. He said, because of fuel, he said, we'll give you a quarter of an hour. And that was very, very enjoyable. Yeah, that was great fun. So that's how I got me trip in a Tigermoth. And there's the cockpit of the Tigermoth. Again, the good old compass there. That piston engine Provost. When I was at Lynham on the Hercs, we had one in the hangar, and it was operated by one of the Herc captains, Mike Crimble, I remember his name. And he came in one day and he said, bit of a backhanded compliment, he said, you're quite old, Pete. He said, ever worked on Provost engines? So I said, yeah, funny enough. I said, good old Leonidas, radial engine. I said, did those during the apprenticeship as well? And so I used to do some work on the engine for him with the oil filter and stuff like that, and refuel it. And in return for that, I used to get the occasional flight. And you could throw that around as well. It's quite a, that old engine pushed out about between 600 and 700 shaft horsepower, which was quite powerful for a single engine aircraft, and flew very, very well. Fully aerobatic. Jodel, French design, and one of our flight engineers, Chris Drinkwater, had one of these, again, parked in our hangar at Lynham. And he came in one day and he showed me a set of drawings, and he said, I want to modify the brakes on it, because the brakes were very, very poor. They were shoes, but the shoes were expanded by an airbag. And he said, they're virtually ineffective. He said, I have got, he was operating under the Popular Flying Association rules, and somebody had come up with a disc brake conversion. He said, can you make these bits a machine, the existing wheels, because the wheel had the brake drum cast into it. And I've got a little workshop at home. And I said, yeah, I reckon I can do that. Anyway, I made these bits. They had to go off and be inspected. And then they were approved. We fitted them. And again, he said, what do I owe you? And I said, I'll have a flight. And we took off from Lynham, did a roller at Lockmead Farm, and that was quite enjoyable. Then things started to go a bit downhill with Chris. He'd persuaded a friend of his, he was our COSA rep at Lynham. He had a little light aircraft called a Calibri, and that had a Volkswagen engine in it. And Chris persuaded him to let him fly it. And he let it idle too long and oiled the plugs. And he stalled it and put it in the ground. He wasn't injured, but he wrote the aircraft off and said, no, there was something wrong with the aeroplane, and refused to do anything about it, which I think was wrong. If you borrow something off somebody, you give it back to them in the same condition. So I then sort of distanced myself away from Chris, didn't do any more work on the aircraft. And then about 15 years ago, I think it was, he was flying Zlin, and he did a impromptu aerobatic display and killed himself. Cherokee 180, again, nice aeroplane, and got to fly in that. Bryce Norton Flying Club had a couple, and a friend of mine who was also a crew chief on the VC-10s, had got a PPL, but didn't like navigating, and I enjoyed navigating. So we used to go around the countryside, and air traffic said one day, you know, who are the pilots? And he went to work for the CA in the end, Ken Bannister. And he said, the pilot is an airframe fitter and the navigator is an engine fitter. Never been that struck on helicopters. However, this happened when I was on the Belfast, and they were doing a exercise in Turkey at a NATO base called Incirlik, dreadful place. And they needed an engine, so there was a spare engine in Cyprus. So we flew out to Cyprus, picked up the spare engine in the Belfast, and then took it out to Incirlik. I met by a guy that I'd worked on javelins with. Then I met up with him in Gan. In fact, he was the bloke that first taught me to refuel VC-10s, Ray Wickens. He said, "I'm pleased to see you with that engine." He said, "The only trouble is," he said, "half my crew are down with a stomach bug." Well, we got 2 days on the ground there because we were doing another job afterwards. So I said, well, I don't fancy, sitting around doing nothing. And I gave him a hand to change the engine. The pilot came out and Ray said, "Oh, this is Peter. He's a friend of mine from way back." He said, "You're giving me a hand while the blokes are sick." "Oh," he said, "fine." Anyway, he said afterwards, he said, "How'd you give me a hand?" He said, "Would you like to come on air test with us?" And I'd never flown in a Puma before. And the first thing I noticed, I'd never flown in a helicopter before, the actual vibration. And I said to Ray, he said, "No, this is a good one." But I must admit, you cannot throw those things around. Very surprised. So that was me.
Peter, they come past our roads at 1 o'clock in the morning. They're flying at 150 feet.
Yeah.
They use oil for the intermediate. Don't know why, but
Yeah.
they're looking for you then.
Yeah. Got a contract out on you.
You feel like opening the window and letting the bugger through.
Yeah. Another job I got while we were on the Belfast was to take a Bell Jet Ranger out to Turkey, but this time to Ankara. It was a bit of a strange setup because when we got on board and it had been loaded, it was painted in military colours, but it had a civil registration with a civilian pilot. Anyway, the guy said, "Oh, we're delivering it out for the trial for the Turkish Air Force." So he said, "Okay then." So we went to Cyprus, refueled, and then on to Turkey. And he was sitting there looking a bit worried, and the captain was chatting to him. And again, the captain says, "Oh, I've got a bloke here that can fix anything." So I said, "What's wrong?" He said, he said, obviously it didn't come with the blades on. They came in a separate box. So he said, "Don't know how to fit the blades." Well, luckily, he got what almost like a Haynes manual for a Jet Ranger. So I thumbed through it and I said, yeah, we're okay there. We got some ladders out when we got there after I'd sorted out the aircraft and fitted these blades. And he said, how long you worked on these? About an hour and a half. So he said, would you like to come on the air test? So I said to the captain, you happy? Yeah, he said, off you go. And he was very, very good. And he actually gave me a mini flying lesson and he taught me how to hover, which is very, very difficult. Yep. Yeah. And so that's how I got my trip in a Jet Ranger. Going back to gliding times, that's a Blarney, the first all-metal. Nice to fly in. And fully aerobatic. And I used to fly out of Bicester. And the chief flying instructor there was a bloke called Andy, can't remember his surname. Anyway, I was stationed at Brives then, and we had our first open day, and he came over, had an aerotow over to do an aerobatic display, and it was the second one he'd done that day. When he did that, he did an outside loop, which the aircraft wasn't stressed for, and both wingtips folded. I knew what was happening because you could see. The crowd thought it was part of the display because these wingtips came down like sycamore seeds. And he spiraled down, hit the ground behind the control tower, and basically when they got to him, it was like a rag doll, dead. So he, being stupid, he did kill him. So very sad, but it was nice. As I say, they were nice to fly in. Now, that's what I did my solo in. Yeah, Kirby Cadet. Great fun.
Glide profile of a houseboat.
Yeah, yeah. But the thing I liked about it, as opposed to the Sedberg, that was tandem. With the Sedberg, you're side by side. So you can always sense somebody's sitting by the side of you when you're flying. When you sat in that front cockpit and were concentrating, you forgot about the bloke behind you. So you're virtually flying by yourself. And I can always remember, it was up at Sileston. And every time you came down, he'd give you a debrief. And he said, now what do you think of that one? I said, I thought it was pretty good. And he said, yeah, best you do the next one by yourself. And they used to put a weight on the back to compensate for nobody being in the thing. And at a later time, when they sold off all these the Kirby Cadets, they did a set of plans where you took the front cockpit off there, and again mounted a Volkswagen engine onto it, and it was called a motor tutor, I think. I even got the plans at one time, and then unfortunately, due to buying a house and having 2 young children, that went out the window.
But there's the vintage gliding club just down the road. They actually still fly the Kirby Cadet and the Zedberg.
Yeah, yeah. There it is. Masses of instruments.
Is that
Yeah.
to flush the toilet up?
Yeah. Look, fly by wire. Look, yeah. No, that ditches your. Most of the time, we did launches from a cable, winch cable, and used to get to the top. Then you used to start feeling it pulling you down. So you put the nose down, and then you had 2 real big tugs on that, and that used to release the cable. And then you carried on, and you used to get about 3. That's right. Yeah, about 3 minutes of flying. Yeah. But it's amazing how much they could teach you in 3 minutes. Yeah. Yeah. Good fun. Now this machine, we called it Grasshopper. it was called the primary glider, and the design originated in Germany for teaching the Hitler Youth to fly. After you'd done your flying in the thing, they then gave you, on the air cadets job, a gliding instructor's course on this, because it was only intended not to be towed up. That looks like it's going up on the winch cable by the angle there, you can see there. And you used to launch it or spin it across the ground on a bungee. School on the cadet force could apply to have one of these, and the MOD would fund a garage and all the equipment, because this all dismantled and you put it together with pins and things. So when we used to go down to the school, they used to say, can we have the primary glider out? Yeah, okay then. And what we used to do, it was a sort of training exercise as well. We used to say to one of the corporals, right, you control what's going on. You tell the other cadets. But once it was pinned together, we had to do the first hop or slide or whatever we were doing on the day. And we were down at Sherborne School in Dorset. We put it all together, and there was a bit of a stiff breeze blowing, and I got one hell of a blooming launch off the bungee. And we were on the hallowed sports ground with all the cricket squares, and we had to stay away from those. And as I say, I got a nice launch. I was about 6 to 10 feet above the ground, holding it there quite nicely. And I cleared the first one, and I could hear the cadets shouting, 1. I cleared the next one, 2. Then I started showboating, silly devil. And I was clearing all these. Then I looked up, and there's a sports pavilion. I thought, never going to climb over it, I'll stall. Whilst I was doing my basic training on the gliding, one of the gliding instructors said, because gliders, the old basic ones we had, didn't have brakes or anything, if you put it down on the skid, forward bit of pressure on the stick, you can actually not get it to dig into the ground, but get a bit of friction. And I stopped 3 feet away from the cricket pavilion. A very stupid, wise man. Motorfolk. We had one of those at Bicester, and the reason I got to fly in that was because it was powered, and I did all my stalls training in the motorfolk, because you have more time to do it than getting 3 minutes off the cable. And thing they're quite nice to fly in, and the Air Force had these as well. Now, what did they call them, Dom? We had these, didn't we?
Yeah.
No, I can't think of the name of them. And the last machine I ever flew in, I'd done one tour on Hawks, came back to Herc. Oh no, I did the cadet tour then, back onto Hercs. And then again out of the blue, they said you're being promoted, but you're back up to Valley. And one of my guys had a microlight, and he said, you fancy a flight? And that is good fun. Once you get used to the fact that when you look down by the side, there's no visible means of support. And what he would do, we took off, do one circuit. If you weren't too terrified, then we went up to the top of the island, round a windmill that was there. And, but good fun. And of course you could, reasonably cheaper way of flying and getting your license. And that was my last machine I ever flew in. And that is it, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Anyone got any questions?
Anyone got any questions?
I could say, Peter, we had a fault in the Swindon landing. Sorry, not fault. So, we had the metal glider.
Yeah, motorfolk.
No. Our brain's gone.
The
Blarney? Yeah.
And it was our primary training aircraft.
Yeah, it was not, say no, very smooth.
Yes, except that if you got the tail down on landing, the student got down tail first. You had to replace all of the metal
That's right.
vertical bit.
Yeah.
And the first motor glider I flew in was actually a fault, but an earlier version of that.
Mm.
And I used to regularly fly that once a month around the area.
Yeah.
Or when I go on quick,
Yeah. Racking my brains, I think what we called those.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, but the one I flew was XRAF,
Yeah.
but it wasn't.
No. Because I tried to get myself qualified because they used to overhaul them down at RF Locking. There was a glider, RF glider thing there, and they used to overhaul them down there. And they always used to have to dismantle them and trailer them then. And I always tried to get myself authorised so I could fly them. But never happened. Didn't have enough time, get the hours in. But as I say, thoroughly enjoyed myself in the RAF. Never complained about it. But, had a couple of jobs I didn't like. I got posted onto missiles, which was boring, but they posted me out to Malaya and Singapore to do it, so didn't complain too much about that. Yeah.
Lost on Luna. In that.
Um,
On holiday too.
well, no, sorry, that wasn't the last one. The last one I flew in was the Evans VP2 because that was up at Valley and then got posted down to St Athan, and that's where I flew in the Evans with me wing commander. Yeah, he was a nice guy. Yeah, so that was 94.
Have to get you up in the Austrian with the Yak then.
Yeah, I'd love to fly in the Yak. Yeah,
See if I can sort that out.
yeah, thanks. Yeah. Yeah. No, that wasn't a specific one. That was just a picture I found when I was putting the talk together on, but it was very, very similar to that. Very, very strange flying a microlight because when you're flying a conventional aeroplane, if you want to go up, you pull back on the stick. And if you want to go down, you pull back. But the wing is the opposite way round. Very strange. Yeah. And when you want to turn, you just slide the wing out. That bar, you just slide it out to turn. But it's great fun. It really is.
Peter, did they have piston engine Provost at RF 30 flying training school?
Not when I was in the Air Force,
No.
to my knowledge.
I can remember when I was at school.
But I shouldn't be at all surprised they did because South Sunny was one of our major training bases.
This was about 54, and we were taken up there by one of the teachers. He said, obviously, they were trying to get primary school kids into the RAF. And we went up there one Saturday, and we weren't going to fly in it, but it was part of 2 or 3 of them parked up there in the control tower.
Yeah. When I joined the Air Force, we went down to workshops. Let's say it was 59, 60. There were quite a few piston Provosts for us to practice engine changes on. Of course, we're used to sit in those and play hanger pilots, you know.
One being rebuilt, I don't know if it's still there. It was a couple of years ago at Bruton. Down near Andover, there's a little airfield down there.
Yeah.
There's one being rebuilt down there. And there was another one that came up for sale.
I don't know what happened to the one at Lynham that Mike Crimble used to fly because he was a Herc pilot, Herc captain, and he proudly bought it while he was over there. He bought one of the Burt Rutan. They're real high. What can I say? Very revolutionary, the shape of them, and all fiberglass. And he bought one of those. And then he got posted up to Cranwell as a flight commander. And I don't know where he went from there, because at one time, because we were quite friendly, a C-47 came up for sale. And he said, how do you fancy putting all your money into it with me? And as I say, want the fact that I'd still got 2 young children then. And I couldn't really afford to throw all my gratuity away on it. But it was very, very tempting.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Peter.
Yeah, okay.